So this story begins when my grandmother needed me to help paint her house. This lady on a ladder would, at best, result in a broken hip, and at worst, a broken neck. I suppose she could have hired some professional painters, but she happened to live in the middle of nowhere, and our family has this annoying habit of always staying poor, so hiring laborers would be too costly. For context, my whole family on my mother's side are Jehovah's Witnesses. I'm guessing this happened some time after the family crossed the Atlantic. This has led to them becoming very strange, but nothing that would warrant serious concern. For example, they are firm believers in the paranormal, and the idea that invoking God's name can thwart off threats. After studying my family history, I decided that this was a major improvement from our semi-nomadic gypsy ancestry, which had a tendency to give me the shivers thinking about the strange things that our ancestors did. So I arrived at my grandmother's house on a small lot of land in the middle of nowhere. A few houses are within eyesight, but the place is fairly isolated. The only noise you heard, aside from the noise that you yourself made, was that of the neighbor's rooster in the morning. As soon as I got in the door, she tried to sell me on this month's issue of The Watchtower, a church-issued magazine. Yeah, okay, Grandma. So what parts of the house am I painting? She had just moved into this new house, so she gave me a tour. The first thing I noticed was how basic it was. She wasn't at risk of freezing, but there were patches with no insulation. Instead of paint on many of the walls, there was this ancient, cheap wallpaper that was fading. The whole place gave me this run-down and cheap sort of feel. One bit that weirded me out was how strangely the house was planned out, or rather how little of it was planned out. There were seemingly random doorways and chambers, which was more than a little unnerving, considering that many of these rooms served little obvious purpose. The house was a medium size, which was large considering it was only housing my grandmother and her 12-year-old dog. The creepiest thing about the place, though, was how much the old owners had abandoned there. Books, clothes, rusty tools, kitchenware, children's toys, and the like. Apparently her inner gypsy kicked in and decided all this leftover worthless trash could be valuable. That or she needed a cheap place, and when the landowner said as is, they really meant as is. It becomes apparent that this trip to paint her house may extend a few days, so I can work to make her home more habitable. I decide that I'll get started on the place first thing in the morning, seeing as how I had arrived around 8:30 and it was now nearly 10 p.m. So we eat dinner in the living room, and I get set up on the couch. About 30 minutes into trying to sleep, I'm ripped from my trance by the sound of footsteps down the hallway. Grandma? No response. I don't know what's going on, but I feel anxious. So I reach down to the floor and pull my pocket knife out of my shoe. Something about this place just gives me bad vibes. While I'm fumbling around on the ground for my knife, I can hear some items being shuffled about in the darkness down the hallway. I freeze. Not being able to see it makes me increasingly nervous. I know that if it starts coming towards me, I'll be able to see it coming by the bluish-gray moonlight cast across the hallway. In the silence that follows, I can hear my grandmother snoring loudly further down the hall. Nothing happens for some time. Whatever it was, it didn't sound particularly threatening, just unexpected. As I attempted to go back to sleep, I could hear something softly pattering about in the attic, which starts to feel less threatening over time, and I eventually drift off to sleep. The next morning, I asked my grandmother if she has a rodent problem, seeing as how this house was anything but modern, and critters could easily get in. No rats or raccoons, she says. We hear the crackling of her gravel driveway, and somebody in an 80s Chevy square-body truck stops outside the house. It's the neighbor. He starts explaining how he heard some weird stuff last night, and he wanted to make sure that I was aware of the property lines. Weird, I haven't left the building since I got here. We'll keep an eye out. Apparently the last person to live here was another old lady that died about 10 years ago. At this point, I'm not too worried about anything, so I go about my plan to start painting. This goes on without incident for about 6 hours, until I start to paint one of the purposeless rooms. The stepladder is facing a wall, and I'm on the top rung painting the corner in between the wall and the ceiling. I'm thinking about this sophomore girl from back at school and painting away when I hear something above me that makes my heart sink. It's the kind of sound that is made when somebody makes a single step or puts pressure on one foot on a creaky board. A slow, moaning creak. I have a mini panic attack, ditch the brush, and jump off the ladder with my hands up. It's rats. I'm frustrated, feeling like I just shaved 3 months off of my life from how fast my heart was pounding. I calm down and inspect the room for anomalies, until I see that there is a trap door leading to the attic from this room. Okay. Grandma, could you come up in here? I proceed to ask her about the attic, and if she has started to store things up in there yet, as it was my cousins who moved her in here. What a surprise, more abandoned items from the previous owner. Also plenty of animal droppings, confirming my raccoon suspicions. Grandma's bringing in boxes for me to lug up there, when I find something very strange. A ring of dead rose petals, some symbols written on the plywood, surrounding some dust or ash, and a plain wooden figure. For some reason, this featureless literal stick figure gave me a strong feeling of dread. Something was off about it. I started to get this paranoid feeling that I didn't belong there, and that I needed to get out. I immediately start telling my grandmother what I found, standing 12 feet above her and speaking through a square hole in the ceiling. Her eyes just double in size, and she turns white. She immediately starts shouting at me to grab the doll with her handkerchief and bring it downstairs immediately. But when I grabbed the doll, the feeling of dread intensified tenfold. It began before I even grabbed it. And as I watched my hand reach out, it was like everything was happening in slow motion. This only lasted for about 5 seconds, but it felt like so much longer. I brought the figurine down and went towards the living room. The front door was open, and my grandma was acting like she had gone psycho. In the middle of the driveway, she was already making a small pile of firewood and lit it with some matches and some kerosene. She shrieks at me to hurry up and throw it in the blaze. We sat there watching it burn, and I felt a huge relief come over me, like the threat was gone. As we watched it burn, I looked at the details on the figure. It had no facial features, and the thing was clearly handmade. You could see the chisel marks in it. About 5 minutes into just standing there watching this thing burn, we hear a loud bang. The front door had slammed shut and bounced open again, about 30 degrees ajar and creeping further. My grandmother wants me to go back inside with her and pray. As crazy as it sounded, I don't fight her on this one. Once inside, she starts a quick but very serious blessing all around the house. Afterwards, assuming that the threat was gone, we decide to call it a day early. And afterwards we play cards, talk, eat dinner, and go to bed like nothing had happened. That night was the same as the previous, in the sense that right when I was about to get some sleep, I wake up to some soft noises in the darkness. This time I realize this is definitely not a raccoon. So I'm staring down the hallway again, looking past my feet, waiting for something to step out into the moonlight and reveal itself. I can feel it creeping back there. As I start to breathe normally again, I can see something in the light. The most horrifying thing I have ever seen begins a kind of hurried walk towards me. The creature was about 5 feet tall, humanoid, with long black hair, and I cannot distinguish any of its features. Its skin is as black as the void, aside from glowing white eyes. Before I can move, it reaches me, staring me dead in the eyes inches from my face. I scream in terror. I honestly thought I might have just died of fright, because a moment later I blink and see nothing. A hallway light is flicked on and my grandmother comes in to check on me. I'm speechless, but I can sense that she knows what happened. I decide to sleep on the floor in my grandmother's room that night, like a child. But honestly, I have never been more frightened by something I couldn't see in my entire life. The next few days nothing happened, although I never entered the attic again. My grandmother apparently had some elders come to her home and sanctify it, and she didn't mention anything else happening. She moved out of there about 6 months later, and I haven't been there since. The entity in question is something I have only read about online twice. They all describe it in the same way: short, black, humanoid, and it moves quickly. I wish I knew what it was.